Well, all right, my friends, let's do this. David Parsons here. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. I hope you're doing well, despite the continued disintegration of American democracy. You know, just when you think things can't get worse, you open up your phone and there's some news alert that tells you, yeah, it can. And the last couple weeks have definitely been like that. I will save my thoughts on these things for our News Trap episode. I'll be putting out a new one with Justin Rogers Cooper this Friday. I'm sure we'll be getting into all of the latest developments, including, whatever horrific thing is on my phone waiting for me right now when I'm done recording this introduction to this episode. But again, let's save that for the News Trap. Check that out on the episode description. We've got a link to our Patreon. That's where those News Trap episodes live. Today, though, we're talking about Rolling Stone magazine. Rolling Stone magazine was an indispensable resource for me as a young person in America. I thought Rolling Stone was so cool, and it was like an entryway into what was cool about American pop culture. However, when I was young, I didn't really realize the wider history of the magazine, that it was born out of the 1960s counterculture, that the creator of Rolling Stone magazine was an entrepreneur named Jann Wenner who was sort of thinking about how to capitalize, essentially, on the counterculture, but also how to make the ideas in all of that early rock and roll youth culture actually live in the American mainstream. And of course, he was enormously successful in that project, and Rolling Stone became the mainstream in a lot of ways. And there are so many ironies involved in that story. My guest today is a historian named Charles L. Ponce de Leon. He has written a number of really cool books about American culture, about American media, including one called Fortunate Son, The Life of Elvis Presley, and another one called That's the Way It Is, A History of Television News in America. But his latest book is coming out next month from the University of North Carolina Press. It's called Rolling Stone and the Rise of Hip Capitalism, How a Magazine Born in the 1960s Changed America. So this is a super fun conversation for me. Obviously, if you listen to Nostalgia Trap over the years, you know that my particular historical obsessions live in the path from the 60s and 70s into our current moment and what's changed and the kind of legacy of that counterculture. So this was a really eye-opening and fun conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. And if you are interested in hearing more of me and my friend John Lombardo talking about rock and roll and the history of rock, particularly in the 1990s, go check out my other podcast. It's called 120 Months. We are listening to all of the major album releases from the 90s month by month, giving our takes, opinions, reviews, etc. That's been a super fun set of conversations for me, and you can check all that stuff out in the link in the episode description. I appreciate you listening to all the content I'm putting out, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Here's me talking with Charles L. Ponce de Leon. Charles Ponce de Leon, you've not only got a great name, but a series of books that caught my attention when I found your bio on the University of North Carolina Press website. I want to say the name of a couple of your books because I think that people that listen to this show and just me myself, I was sort of like blown away. These are the kinds of things we like to talk about on this show. But you've got a book called Self-Exposure that's about sort of the birth of the celebrity journalism in the early 1900s. You've got a book called Fortunate Son, which is a bio of Elvis Presley. You've got a book called That's the Way It Is, about television news in the U.S. And your latest book is coming out later this spring called All the News That Fits, Rolling Stone Magazine and the Rise of Hip Capitalism. So it seems like you've been on this beat for a while, thinking about American culture and politics and sort of media, right?
I have, yeah. I mean, most of my career, I actually, in college, thought about being a journalist, and I ended up sort of moving into academia, and but it was inspired in part by the same interests in the way things work, the way culture works, the way it connects to politics and social trends, and you know, in some respects, doing this book has been a way for me to sort of attempt to tie things together from throughout my career and think about them more holistically.
That's great. Yeah, because I love the subtitle about hip capitalism and sort of, I feel like there could be a question mark there with hip capitalism in terms of like what is that? How much has it changed the tone of what capitalist culture is? Because it seems like Rolling Stone is in a lot of ways the linchpin of thinking about the change in the tone of capitalism in the post-war period. Is that what you're getting at in this book?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, you know, I mean, so hip capitalism originated. The term was first invoked in the late 60s, and it was invoked first by um, um, critics of Rolling Stone and Jann Wenner. So, you know, new leftists, you know, hardcore counterculturalists, you know, who were very cognizant of the potential of alternative and oppositional energies being quote unquote co-opted. Um, and so, and the belief was that, you know, the system was going to drain all these things of their energy and vitality and oppositional potential and essentially defang them. And so, again, the term originated as a critique, and it was
Mm.
one that was leveled often at Jann Wenner. It was leveled at some other people too here in the San Francisco Bay Area, most notoriously it was leveled against Bill Graham, the pioneering rock music, you know, live music promoter. Um, and um, and I'm taking the term and I'm applying to you know, I'm trying to think about it more agnostically, you know, without as much judginess.
Yeah.
And what I've sort of settled on is I think it's a good descriptor of all kinds of entrepreneurial and organizational activities that emerged in the 60s, responding to a recognition that the values and tastes and attitudes and behavior of substantial numbers of younger Americans were different. And there were products they were yearning for that weren't being provided by the mainstream culture industries. And you know, you can see that in the rise of quote unquote new Hollywood in the movie industry. You know, you see it obviously in music. You see it in journalism. And Rolling Stone was you know, was perhaps the best example of its appearance in journalism.
So it makes me think that there must have been people who thought Rolling Stone and its creators were villains from the beginning. Like I say that because I know it's been a while since I read this, but I remember the moment that happened. I think it might have been 66, the human being in San
Yeah,
Francisco, right? Where you had that sort of split. And it's interesting because it was like it's only one of the only moments I can think of where that split was talked about so directly in terms of the split between like the counterculture kids who were finding truth in acid and things like that, and then the like SDS radicals who were
yeah.
more almost old left in their thinking about how to make change in society. And it's interesting because it's not a lot of the same people, obviously, but there was more of a team sort of vibe to it back then. Am I wrong?
Well, I think one thing that's important to emphasize is that in its earliest years, the new leftists that coalesced around SDS and others who shared their views, who were not necessarily young. And here I'm thinking of the journalists who created Ramparts magazine, or the left version of Ramparts magazine. They were very disdainful of the counterculture. They were very disdainful of sort of cultural dissidence
Mm.
because they thought it distracted from the real work of political organizing and political protests. And as the Vietnam War escalated, you know, they thought, you know, there were real life and death issues at stake, and that the counterculture was a distraction. And so, actually, in SDS, there was a very substantial split until the late 60s between the quote unquote politicos and those interested in and sympathetic to the counterculture. And so they didn't get along, and they were disdainful of each other. And that the escalation of the Vietnam War, and especially the election of Richard Nixon and the new policies of the Nixon administration, brought those two camps more closer together. And increasingly,
Yeah.
counterculturalists began to embrace a left political identity, and some of the some in SDS, one faction in particular, the sort of left cultural faction, one splinter, which was the Weather Underground, they embraced countercultural ideas, and they became great believers that the revolution included a lot of things associated with the counterculture. So there becomes a kind of a rapprochement between the two tendencies by the late 60s, especially the election of Nixon and Nixon's new policies and all the things that followed from that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was thinking of the Weather Underground while you were talking there because those film reels of them in their houses, they look like hippies. They're talking about acid. And it seems like the counterculture element, and even the drug element, is part of what catalyzes their politics in a lot of ways and drives them
Yeah.
into their almost like revolutionary dream. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about Jann Wenner and where he comes from and how he's thinking about this stuff. Because reading just the synopsis of your book, I didn't realize, or I guess maybe I forgot that he was part of the free speech movement at Berkeley, which was such an important moment in creating a lot of the streams of culture and political thought you're touching on here. So where does he
Yeah,
come from?
well,
Yeah.
yeah, Jan's an interesting character with a very interesting history. He was never exactly a hippie, though countercultural adjacent. He was never exactly a new left radical, though new left adjacent. And so, he grew up in an affluent, family in the San Francisco Bay Area, and went to a boarding school in Los Angeles. And so, he was a privileged person, as he would acknowledge and has acknowledged. But he became interested and sort of caught up in all these things happening in the 60s. So in some respects, he's the sort of perfect embodiment of a trend that became the inspiration for Rolling Stone. And that trend wasn't so much the counterculture. It wasn't so much rock music. It wasn't so much new left politics, but it was this melange of all those things that Wenner thought were influencing a much wider range of young Americans, including people like himself. And so what's interesting about Jan is, he had that recognition. He had that recognition because he himself was entranced by some of these features. I mean, he's said in print, that LSD changed his life. I mean, he developed a different vantage point toward all kinds of things in this period, and it wasn't only because of LSD. It was because of other things, the press of external events like the escalation of the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and so Jan saw that there were all kinds of people like himself who weren't necessarily going to become hippies, weren't necessarily going to become radicals, but were their values were changing. They were being and he thought that cohort of people was potentially enormous, and it could have in the long run tremendous social and political influence.
Mm.
And so, Rolling Stone was sort of born out of that recognition and out of a belief that a commercial institution, all kinds of commercial institutions, were required to address and cater to that growing audience.
I'm wondering how it becomes a commercial thing because I mean, obviously, in the longer view, the story of Rolling Stone is often seen as like like the rest of a lot of the '60s revolutionary cultural potential. Is it it's a cynical view of it? Is it all becomes corporate, gets washed out by Wall Street and money, and by the time you get to the '80s,
Yeah.
it's over. But I mean, I'm wondering about it from the very beginning because it was Rolling Stone was born in a context where the underground magazines and newspapers were everywhere. And I remember discovering the San Francisco Oracle at some point, which I'm sure
Yeah,
you've seen, is just
yeah.
beautiful. I mean, it's honestly one of the most stunning visual productions in print culture in the 20th century, I think. But how is Rolling Stone sort of positioning itself with as related to the rest of the underground press? Because they didn't really stay underground; they became like a sort of big
Yeah,
commercial thing. And how much was
yeah.
that part of the vision?
Yeah, well, I mean, Jan never intended Rolling Stone to be alternative, underground. He always intended it to be a big commercial success because he believed that that cohort of people that I just mentioned earlier, whose values were changing, would ultimately, as a result of the sheer numbers of young people in the 60s and 70s, would become the dominant culture. I mean, he really thought that they were the entering wedge of an enormous transformation. And so he thought the mainstream would change, and Rolling Stone for him was in the vanguard of that change. So his intention from the outset was never anti-commercial. It was never countercultural. It was never to be an alternative, except insofar as the different kind of journalism in Rolling Stone would prefigure all kinds of changes in the culture industries that would reflect the growing influence of this cohort of young people who were changing, whose views and attitudes and values were changing so decisively.
So it's like, I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth or yours, but it seems like the philosophy is something akin to, instead of like overthrowing capitalism, we're sort of like we're reforming it from within. We're changing the tone
Exactly.
of it. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Jan was raised by liberal Democrats.
Hmm.
He met Adlai Stevenson at a fundraiser his parents hosted, when he was a child,
That's great.
and when he went to Cal, he fell in with a group of students in Slate, which was a student organization who were essentially liberal reformers. I mean, they included more radical people because that was the tendency of the early 60s when Jan went to Cal. But in general, he was always a liberal, never a radical. Um, but he was deeply influenced by some of the things occurring, like the free speech movement. Though he was not a participant, he covered it as a journalist. I mean, he worked while at Cal as a stringer for the NBC radio affiliate in San Francisco, and one of the assignments, originally he was just like a gopher, but then one of his assignments became to cover events uh, uh, at Cal, since
Hmm.
he was a student there. And so when the free speech movement occurred, he was right there, not as a participant. I mean, though he sympathized with it, but as a journalist. And that experience, is, Jan has talked about, sort of catalyzed him an interest in sort of finding a way to combine uh, supporting causes with journalism, and that's
Hmm.
sort of led in part to Rolling Stone's interest and commitment to a certain kind of left liberal advocacy, which he saw as perfectly compatible with journalism.
Yeah, and with a music magazine too, right? Because like when I think of Rolling Stone, I think of it primarily as a vehicle for telling me which albums to buy, and a little bit of what movies to watch. I mean, I came to Rolling Stone in the 80s and 90s, so it was a very different magazine, I think, than the one in the 60s. But they were still doing. I mean, Hunter S. Thompson was still in there, and they were still like they still had political articles, but how much of it was conceived as a sort of confluence of music, as a vehicle for the revolution too,
Well,
whatever revolution we're talking
yeah.
about. Yeah.
So let me just say two things about that. First of all, I would say one of the principal aims of my book is to debunk the notion that Rolling Stone was just a music magazine
Hmm.
in its first 15 to 20 years. It was in fact a lot more. And the reason it was a lot more, and this is the second point I'm adding, is because Jan believed, and others did too at the time, that the distinctive kind of rock music that was emerging in the mid 60s was tied in terms of sensibility, in terms of outlook, to many other changes that were going on in the culture. In other words, um, so in a sense, focusing on rock music was the entree because there was obviously a large audience of people, young people interested in it who were not being well served by existing publications. That and again in that time the existing publications were trade publications like Billboard
Hmm.
and then teen magazines, which, actually did interview, rock musicians, notable rock musicians, but, they didn't necessarily ask the questions that serious music fans wanted to hear. I mean, maybe some of them did,
Right.
but not all. And so rock music was the most readily available point of entry for Jann and Rolling Stone. But from the first issue, where Jann sort of published a kind of statement of purpose of what the magazine was about. He made it clear that the culture exemplified by the rock music of the mid 60s, reflected something more. There was more going on. And from the beginning, there was interest in addressing some of that other stuff going on, whether it was in the visual arts, whether it was books, whether it was film. And then by 1969 and 70, it was politics, because for Jann and many of his writers, the cultural changes that they were so hopeful about in 1967, seemed threatened by the revanchist policies of the Nixon administration and the rise of Nixon's silent majority,
Yeah.
and so that's what pivoted Rolling Stone to politics, even though, again, it never became a political magazine. And, rock music was always, or mostly, in the foreground. The interest in covering a wider array of phenomena was there from the beginning. The trick commercially to keep the publication alive, to keep it successful, was doing that without turning off the people like you and me who were first drawn to the magazine for the music,
Right. Right.
and that was always the trick. And so Jann had the aspiration from the beginning to use music as a launching pad. And then in the early 70s, he thought, as people grew older, people like himself, his cohort, the cohort that he's been addressing from the beginning, as they grew older, it seemed like the magazine could become more of a general interest magazine, still cover music, but not to the same degree.
Mm.
And so for the next 15 years or so, Jann toggled between focusing uh, uh, more widely and crafting Rolling Stone, or sort of constructing Rolling Stone as a general interest magazine, and then focusing on music as interest in music waxed and waned. And so that's one of the plot lines in my book are these. He broadens it, he brings it back,
Mm.
focuses more,
Hmm.
foregrounds music.
Yeah.
That's one of the stories, at least, on the surface,
Yeah.
that I tell between that. Because, for Jann, a general interest magazine meant wider social and political influence. He wanted to have influence over the Democratic Party, steer it to the left. He wanted influence socially and culturally, and he didn't think just a music magazine, or principally a music magazine, would ever allow him to do that. And so the the interest in being a general interest magazine was in many ways inspired by his commitment to advancing the agenda of the cohort that he had identified as his principal audience, with whom he felt he shared so much.
It's a Trojan horse theory a little bit, it seems like, right? It's
Yeah.
like you get the ideas in through the music, but part of it makes me wonder, and I wonder what you think about this, is that sort of uneasy, that tension between the politics and the music. Like the assumption that people that are into rock music are all going to be sort of receptive to left or liberal ideas. How much is that true? Because so much of that, I think, has been talked about a lot in the years since and all the way to today, in terms of, I mean, the sort of cliche in the way that I think I talked about it with my friends in the 90s was with like bands like Rage Against the Machine and people that were listening to it that we considered reactionaries and conservatives, and we're like, Aren't you listening to the lyrics of what they're saying, but they're just
Yeah.
into it for the rock, you know, and the sort of
Yeah.
subversive element. So I guess I'm asking like sort of what is the relationship between the counterculture and left liberal politics, and how has Wenner sort of negotiated that in the history of Rolling Stone?
Well, for one thing, Wenner recognized by 1969 that rock music had no inherent politics, you know. And so very quickly he and his writers were disabused of the notion that it had any left potential or impact, you know.
Already by
So
69, that's amazing.
yeah, by
Yeah.
69, it was clear, and
Yeah.
part of that is that there were any number of rock musicians who were avowedly rejecting any association with politics. I mean, they just wanted to make music. They were artists.
Yeah.
And but for Jan, there was I wouldn't call it political, but there was certainly a dimension for Jan and Rolling Stone where the magazine sought to encourage the aspirations and autonomy of artists. And so part of its agenda musically was to make readers aware of the most significant and culturally important artists and promote them. And often they weren't the most commercially successful ones. So there was always an element. Rolling Stone was always very curated, you know.
Hmm.
There were especially, before the mid 80s, and they would acknowledge popular performers, but they championed others who weren't necessarily successful. And so championing the most worthy artists became for Rolling Stone akin to championing political and social movements and particular political figures that they thought were most promising and had the most to offer in terms of moving the country forward in a left liberal direction.
Mm.
So that's the
Yeah.
way it sort of worked. I mean, I think, and that was one of the struggles because um, Jan would note, and his writers would note, when musicians involve themselves in social and political causes that they admired, they would note that and they would cheer it on, But in general, I think that rock music became by the mid 70s, an essentially commercial endeavor,
Yeah.
And so when performers appeared like the Clash, it was a delight for the writers, the music writers, they leaned in because they thought this was a wonderful phenomenon, because here was a band sort of pushing the limits aesthetically and politically, and I think in terms of rock music having a policy, I think Rolling Stone writers were most admiring of musicians who had something to say in the way a novelist or a poet would have something to say in a
Yeah.
in a serious without demanding that it conform to any political line. They were more interested in people addressing things in a serious, substantive way, and most
Mm.
supportive of artists who were willing to do that, whether they succeeded or not.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's almost a description of what hip is, or an edge is to an art is something
Yes.
that's folding the whatever you want to call the critique or the subversion into the art in a way that's compelling, and not just sort of like the SDS guy jumping up at the concert to tell you about the next anti-war rally, but something
Yes.
that almost
Yes.
hits a deeper sort of chord.
Yeah.
No pun intended there. I was thinking about while you were talking there, I was thinking about, that the 70s and the punk movement and all that, because it feels like, and this is part of one of the criticisms that maybe I and others had about Rolling Stone, is they seem so stuck in the 60s. They were sort of like, how many times we're going to see Bob Dylan on the cover of Rolling Stone throughout the
Yeah.
80s, 90s, and 2000s. And that makes sense because it's like that's their association with it. But how much do you think Rolling Stone was able to sort of move along with the culture, and sort of I don't know, retain its relevance and connection to young people, even as it was made by boomers, people that were sort of a certain age group, because it's
Yeah.
it's a youth magazine in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the, I mean, the trick. It was difficult, and I think the magazine really lost its edge. And one reason it lost its edge is because Wenner was still so committed to the legacy acts of the 60s. And
Right.
to be sure, some of those were quite successful commercially. It's shocking how successful commercially the Rolling Stones were, for example, in the 1980s. And so there were commercial reasons, justifiable reasons for Rolling Stone to focus on the Rolling Stones
Yeah.
or Bob Dylan. They were still making music. Was it as good as the music they had made before? No, but there were enough young people, people my age or your age even, who still were interested in those artists to justify covering them. And there were more of those people actually than the ones interested in alternative or indie rock. It was,
Yeah.
and so this was the trick. I mean, Rolling Stone had an opportunity in the late 70s and early 80s to really pivot its music coverage. Um, when rap and when sort of post-punk rock music emerged, and to a degree it did. Now it did at a time when music coverage was being downplayed,
Hmm.
and the magazine was one of its periods of wanting to be a general interest publication. Um, but um, but Wenner was never strongly committed to those newer genres and newer artists, with the exception of U2, who really came around to love and admire.
Oh, that makes so much
Um,
sense. Yeah.
yeah, and so what happened to Rolling Stone is that as so there were so again, it's hard to generalize, but there were rock music fans in the 80s who were sort of still committed to 60s artists or younger artists working in the same vein. I'm thinking of Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, for example. They weren't
Yes.
they weren't influenced by indie rock. They weren't influenced by the Sex Pistols. They weren't influenced by the progenitor of indie rock, which was the Velvet Underground. They weren't interested in that. But there was a cohort of readers who were really interested in that. That was me, for example, and that might have been you too.
Totally.
We were interested. And so people like us resented the amount of coverage that Rolling Stone gave to legacy acts and to acts that were demonstrably influenced by those legacy acts.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and we liked it when they covered the Replacements or REM. Uh, we liked that. We responded, to that, but it was never enough. And it seemed like they only championed those groups uh, fulsomely when they already became successful. And
Yeah.
that's and that's and so but at the same time, the amount of attention that the magazine played to indie rock and some rap by the late 80s, was too much for readers who were committed to what one might call traditionalism,
That's so
in
funny.
rock
Yeah.
music. And so it was really a dilemma for, the writers. Uh, and so what you get is a magazine that has cover stories on only mainstream stars, including old dinosaurs from the 60s, and inside are buried the gushing praise of these indie artists that the music writers really liked, but the magazine, as the sort of establishment organ it had become, couldn't put those guys on the cover because that would hurt sales. Because I mean, by then the audience had grown so large that it made sense commercially to maintain the magazine's circulation, to focus on the stories, and it was usually cover stories, that they knew would sell the best. And again, that's in part because the magazine, like all magazines by the mid 80s, had out of necessity come to rely on market research,
Yeah.
to determine
Mm.
what readers wanted. And mainstream readers didn't want they resented it when REM was on the cover until REM was so huge that they became mainstream,
It's
you
so
know? So,
ironic, the identity trap that these magazines get into. That the sort of like they started out as sort of trying to tap into this rising spirit of the underground, but then as the underground becomes mainstream, it's sort of like, okay, well, what do we do now? Because
yeah,
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 and it's a fickle audience too. I mean,
true.
I do a music podcast where we talk about 90s music, and God, people have opinions when I post things online that are just sort of like you're talking about religion to them, in
Yeah,
terms of their favorite bands and things like that. I was going to ask you, so I was in high school in the early 90s, so it was a big moment for rock music with Nirvana and Pearl Jam and
yeah,
that sort of revolution happening. And what I remember about Rolling Stone, because I was probably getting really into Rolling Stone and other music magazines at the time, was the kids in my high school were into Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and a lot of 60s and 70s bands, and it felt like Rolling Stone was sort of I mean carrying that to a new generation, if that makes sense. Like
yeah,
the figure that I think was the bridge figure in a lot of ways was Neil Young, who was like playing with
yeah.
Pearl Jam and it made me curious about, okay, where does this guy come from? What scene is he from? And that's what made me start picking up albums from these artists. And it was Rolling Stone that, ironically, because they were such an establishment magazine at the time, I'm like, well, this must be the real stuff. This must be really important to know, and so it wasn't dead boomer culture to me at all. It felt like this is the prehistory of the stuff I'm into now, if that makes sense.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, from the beginning, the Rolling Stone music writers, were very conscious of um, addressing the music's history and its roots,
Right.
and so in the beginning, there was as much attention to blues and soul music and R&B as there was to rock. And there was attention to jazz too, and so there was real interest, and that persisted. I mean, they couldn't pay as much attention to it because it was clear that readers weren't interested in that, and that a long story on BB King wasn't what people would purchase,
Right.
So and then when the sort of punk explosion came and post-punk emerged, there were really um, robust debates about what was rock, and writers like Dave Marsh and Grill Marcus, were engaged in thinking about how this music fit in, and by the early '80s, there was a kind of understanding, that this stuff belonged in the canon as much as the Beatles or
Yeah.
Bob Dylan or the Rolling
Yeah.
Stones. And that was very useful because for someone like me who came to it sort of later, understanding, the roots of the music I liked was important. Understanding that it did bear relation to those legacy artists, maybe those legacy artists, the ones that were still making music, weren't as important. Their music wasn't as significant as the stuff that they'd made before, but their earlier contributions had been really decisive and had an influence on younger artists, even younger artists who ostensibly rejected their influence. I mean, it was there. I mean, you
Yes.
couldn't help
Yeah.
not be influenced by the Beatles or the Rolling Stones or Bob Dylan. And so I think that was one of the most useful things that Rolling Stone did is that, and when they would promote artists like Husker Du, they would make a point of likening them to canonical artists that readers who never listened to Husker Du might know, and then might in turn listen to Husker Du and see where they came from and understand their place in a larger sort of history of the music, a kind of genealogy of the music. And the same was
Yeah.
true with rap when they made a point of connecting rap, whether it was to George Clinton or to Sly and the Family Stone or James Brown. I mean, it was the same phenomenon, the same sense to historicize, to contextualize, to
Yeah.
construct a pluralistic canon.
Right. And what's funny is that, it's interesting to hear you say that, Wenner was and the creators of Rolling Stone were seeing a sort of disconnect between the politics and the music by 1969, because in the early 90s it was, I don't know how much Rolling Stone had to do with this, but like listening to Pearl Jam, listening to Nirvana, those bands, they sort of awakened me to a kind of cultural politics that was meaningful, and it made me aware that, okay, if you're into Pearl Jam, maybe these guys are into like Planned Parenthood and pro-choice politics and
Yeah.
not hating gay people, and like all sorts of things that I was made aware of, honestly, by my interest in the music. Like, these
Yeah.
guys are cool, and this is
Yeah.
what cool people think. And it felt like Rolling Stone was part of communicating that to me, as much as we might think of the culture and politics as separate by that point.
Yeah, and that's the same impact it had on me when I read it in the late 70s.
Yeah.
It was the same kind of thing, because then when I was reading it was when punk was emerging,
Hmm.
and to see writers talk about what, music that previously I wouldn't have ever listened to, to see them write about it so intelligently, and to make the connections they were making, and to sort of, especially in the case of the Sex Pistols, sort of link it to developments in Britain, that I didn't understand, but I began to see this as an expression of rage about what was going on in the UK,
Yeah.
and so I think what Rolling Stone did for me was very similar in terms of get me hooked to music, and then encouraged me to think about the connections between music and all these other things that were going on, which in
Yeah.
turn kindled my interest in politics and in other forms of culture, and more importantly, I think, inspired me to want to think about how all this works, how
Yeah.
they're all connected.
Totally. Yeah. How much of this is a depressing story of decline? Because I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, it was in the news that MTV had sort of gone off the air, and they played the Buggles video. The
Yeah.
video killed the radio star. I watched the clip, and at the end
Yeah.
it did the MTV logo on a black screen, and then it just went dark, and I swear I felt a chill that made me want to cry. I was sort of like, this MTV had such an impact on me in the 90s, and for exactly the same reason as Rolling Stone. It showed me that
Right.
there was a cool hip culture that was subversive and connected to a politics that was humane. And that I feel bad for the kids that don't have MTV in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. But Rolling
Yeah.
Stone seems like it follows the similar trajectory, because at some point, MTV turned into something that it wasn't anymore, and it was sort of
Yeah.
a sad
Yeah.
shadow of
Yeah.
itself. And when does that
Yeah.
happen for Rolling Stone? Because I feel the same way about the magazine now, honestly.
Well, I mean, it waxed and waned. I mean, I think that when there were exciting trends, especially in music, and the early '90s is a good one, because you have both the indie rock that you responded to, as well as rap.
Yeah,
There's
right.
really interesting rap
Oh,
bands,
100%.
and so that inspired much more interesting and significant music coverage, and then, of course, that also coincided with the you know Bill Clinton's election, and hope about reversing some of the political trends from the 1980s, and but I think the hard thing, I mean, with Rolling Stone, I think the hard thing was um, Jann Wenner always wanted the magazine to be a success, and to be a commercial success in publishing by the 1980s and 1990s. You needed to adapt to the trends in the industry, and the trends in the industry were personality journalism, celebrity journalism, a degree of sensationalism, a lot more photos and sort of sexy visuals, and
Mhm.
if you didn't embrace that to one degree or another, you doomed yourself to being a niche publication. And the economics of the publishing industry meant that with a niche publication, you couldn't succeed. I mean, and Jan never wanted to have a niche publication. And
Yeah,
again,
yeah,
and part of the reason he didn't want a niche publication is because he wanted that broader influence, including political influence. And so
right.
so I, and when I talk about, the road not taken, in 1980 regarding music and not really foregrounding and emphasizing the most cutting edge music, that was also inspired by a belief that a mainstream commercial magazine, which is what it was, which is what Jan always wanted it to be, it couldn't do that, it couldn't
Yeah.
be niche.
Right.
Um, I mean, there's certain periods where niche publications work commercially, but they tend not to last. And I think with MTV, I don't know as much about MTV, but from what I know, it's the same phenomenon. Is it that the industry changed? I mean, and MTV adapted by uh, um, beginning to program more reality TV.
That's
I
right.
mean,
Yes.
that's where TV was moving. Um, and of course, once you have YouTube, that becomes the principal platform for any kind of visuals that musicians work on, and
Yeah.
they eventually develop their own platforms for producing anything visual that accompanies their music. And so there just isn't a need for it anymore. And so you just adapt to the industry you're in. And that's what happened to Rolling Stone. I mean, the magazine industry changed profoundly between, the its founding in 1967 and the mid 80s. The mid 80s and 90s, that was the heyday of magazine journalism, but a journalism that was, though successful commercially, oriented around sensationalism and sex and celebrity.
Yeah, it's sort
And
of the curse of success. Like as the
yeah,
underground, I mean, they sort of achieve their goal in a lot of ways, right? Because like the underground becomes mainstream, but then it's like, okay, well, what are we now? We are,
yeah.
like where do we go from here? Because the sort of juice of what we were doing was it's subversion, it's counterculture. It's like when counterculture becomes culture.
Right. Well, as
Yeah.
I say, I mean, the end of my book is Jan achieves all his goals, but his magazine and ceases to be hip.
Right. Yeah.
But then there are other organs that pick up the slack. I mean, young people, in the early 90s interested in rap turned to Vibe and The Source, and they turned to those publications,
And it was Pitchfork for me, websites,
Yeah.
honestly, that
Yeah.
were that's where I was finding when I found Pitchfork, I remember being because it was when Pitchfork started, it was just a website that was just sort of like felt like you were finding some treasure trove of people that were talking really about music in a way that I felt like maybe the early Rolling Stone writers were talking about
Yeah.
it. Like this is
I'm
like
sure.
this is like this album is the most vital thing in the world, and and Rolling Stone sort of had come to a place in my mind that was sort of like, okay, that's just ratings of pop music. It's not
Yes.
it doesn't
Yeah.
matter in the same way. I
Yeah.
I wonder how this squares with your first book is about celebrity journalism at the turn of the century, right? And
Yeah.
I was interested to see like sort of like how it seems like the thesis of that book was that celebrity journalism and tabloid journalism, ironically, sort of humanized and brought a reality to these people that had been sort of created by an industry that was very interested in like creating a false image, and celebrity journalism kind of punctured that image. I guess I'm trying to square that with later on Rolling Stone becoming sort of a celebrity magazine. Is it function in the same way? Is it a different moment? Am I sort of
Well,
like
I mean,
comparing things that are 100 years apart, I guess?
it's a different moment, but I think that celebrity journalism is built on the premise that you can't trust appearances.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think, what the distance, both, literal and more broadly between regular people and people in the news, recurrent people in the news, whether they're politicians or business people like Elon Musk, you know,
Icons,
or
yeah.
or movie stars, there's such a distance, and the means by which we can glimpse those people, are always seem uh, contrived or potentially contrived and fake, and
Yes.
so the premise of celebrity journalism was to um, sort of craft narratives and establish ways of seeing famous people that would make them seem real.
Yeah.
And so, in the best example, are journalists who struggle to find out, what movie stars were really like,
Hmm.
because the movie studios is the best example, went to such lengths to craft public personas
Right.
for their stars, But, by the early 1900s, politicians were in many ways doing the same things, and they were employing staff to arrange public appearances by the early 20th century, photo opportunities, that did the same thing. And so a lot of what appears in the media that many people uh, were distrustful of. And so forms of journalism arose that were designed to mollify that
Right.
and either penetrate, um, a space that was inaccessible, or more likely, arrange a kind of negotiation where the celebrity would allow a journalist in, and then they would engage in a kind of dance in which there would be a degree of exposure and then an understanding that only so much of what was revealed could be then presented to the public. And so what celebrity journalism very quickly became is a kind of negotiation between journalists and celebrities, and in between are their publicists, that then present images of the famous that seem more reliable and more authentic and
Yeah.
less likely to be contrived.
I'm glad you
And
said that
so,
word, the authenticity, because it seems like it connects with what Rolling Stone was initially about. Was sort of
yes,
like
yeah,
youth culture is what's real, like this is what's really going on. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and so different from the carefully crafted. I mean, this is the story of Mad Men in a lot of ways that they're telling, right? It's just sort of like
yeah,
the
yeah,
advertising industry and its false sort of image of what American life is like, and then the kids
yeah.
coming up and saying, actually, it's quite different from that, and that connects to politics and everything else. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
well, with and Rolling Stone emerged at a time when some rock musicians were really moving in new directions. There was a lot of innovation and experimentation, and the Beatles had demonstrated that you could do this and remain commercially successful, if not more successful than ever, And so, but 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 there were real risks involved when, for example, musicians made songs, recorded songs that were more than 3 minutes in length and maybe couldn't get played on the radio, or they decided to release an album with no readily identifiable hit single.
Yeah,
And the record companies were like askance about this. I mean, what's going on? Because I mean they saw that as a dumb move. How could you not do that? That's the convention of the commercial music industry. And so
yeah,
musicians and their managers were looking for a forum where they could explain what they were doing. And some of them were quite articulate. I mean, Pete Townsend was probably the most articulate about explaining what he was trying to do in his different musical projects. For Tommy, for example, and he was quite eloquent about it, and artists really liked that. They liked having a forum, Rolling Stone, where they could talk about their music and talk about it seriously. They loved it too because they could talk about other things, whether they were deeply moved by the escalation of the Vietnam War, and they could present themselves as serious people rather than just people hacks making popular music. They
yeah.
and so that appealed to a lot of musicians to be able to do that, to have a place, Rolling Stone, where they could talk about that.
Right,
And
right.
and uh, early on, they gave musicians a lot of space to do that. And they often talked about really sort of specific features of their craft. And of course, later there were magazines like Musician and stuff like that picked up the slack and began to do that. Because, lavishing, 10,000 words on an interview with a musician where he's going into great detail about stuff isn't of interest to all that many readers. And so as
Yeah.
Rolling Stone scaled up, the length of its interviews and profiles of musicians shrank,
Mm.
and obviously to appeal to a wider audience, including more casual listeners of those acts, or maybe even someone who didn't know anything about them, they changed the subject matter to things that were more relevant or more accessible,
Yeah.
and so they
Right.
became less specialized and arcane and more sort of anodyne.
Well, I mean, I'm so glad that you've written this history, and it's been great speaking with you. I know you're like, you remain agnostic about this subject, but part of it, I mean, the title of this podcast is Nostalgia Trap, in part to indicate that there is a trap in thinking about things as like those were the good old days. But it does feel like there's a loss. Like with the decline of Rolling Stone, that it sort of symbolizes a shift in American culture. I feel bad that there's no Rolling Stone anymore, but maybe the cultural moment has passed. Is that how you think about it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, one thing I would ask you, because I think you know more about contemporary culture than me. I mean, there have to be places now online where young people gravitate, where they are also being introduced to what you were describing before, stuff that was hip,
Yeah.
attitudes that were compelling and persuasive and humane. Uh, Forms of music or video, that are interesting and artistically significant, and again, are not necessarily scalable as a mass phenomenon, but are there and available and find their audience. I mean, there have to be. I mean,
Yeah.
there's so much stuff out there. The
I
the
think you're right
problem
about
maybe
that.
is
Yeah.
because there's so much stuff, you can't find it. It's hard to find. You have to almost stumble upon it. So I mean, I think it's there. Um, I just don't know. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure it's there. I'm sure as we speak, there are people in one expressive form or another who are making others aware of things and broadening their perspective and making them feel like their concern about rampant ICE crackdowns, for example, are shared by others, and those concerns are being articulated in expressive forms somewhere
Yeah. I think you're right. I think
online.
it's just more diffuse. I think you're right to say that it's not a mass phenomenon in terms of, there was just turn on MTV and here's where. And I think there are
Yeah,
probably positive and negative things about that, honestly, in terms of,
yeah,
the kind of monoculture approach, and that there's just one magazine that we get all our ideas and opinions and culture from. But yeah, it feels like it moves faster now. I definitely see exactly what you're talking about. It's in the form of usually like, a guy or a girl on YouTube giving their opinions on music that becomes big and viral in its own way. But a lot of that stuff seems ephemeral in a way that Rolling Stone,
yes, yeah,
felt more institutional, if that makes sense. So
yeah. Oh
yeah,
no, no, yeah.
yeah,
And I think ephemeral is the key word to explain contemporary culture.
right.
Yeah,
It's just a wash of. I mean, you can't news things in the news stay for a week and then they're gone, and it just
yeah,
feel. I mean, one of the most striking things I've read is just from the late '90s when Columbine happened in '99. Columbine was the front page news. Still, 30 days after it had
yeah,
happened, it was still the top of the fold New York Times story. And I'm sort of
yeah.
like, what stories are like that anymore? Even if they're things that are as transformative and profound as Columbine, they don't really make an impact in the same way. We live
They
in
don't.
a different media environment for sure.
Yeah, completely different. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, this was so much fun. I really appreciate you talking with me, and I want to say the name of your book again before we go, and it'll be out later. I'll make another announcement when it comes out because I want everyone to check this out. It's called All the News That Fits: Rolling Stone Magazine and the Rise of Hip Capitalism, out from University of North Carolina Press. Charles Ponce de Leon, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
Well, okay, folks, that's it for this episode of Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank my guest, Charles L. Ponce de Leon, for a super fun, super thought-provoking conversation. I wonder what you think of it. hit us up on our Patreon. That's where you can find all of the Nostalgia Trap stuff. That link is in the episode description. And if you haven't subscribed already, you can do that and access all of our News Trap episodes, including the new one we'll be putting out this Friday with our good friend Justin Rogers Cooper. Always looking forward to those. Go check out Charles L. Ponce de Leon's book. It's called Rolling Stone and the Rise of Hip Capitalism: How a Magazine Born in the 1960s Changed America. Super, super cool stuff. We'll be talking to you very soon. Thanks so much for being a Nostalgia Trap listener. Take care. Bye-bye.